My family rejected me for marrying a poor mechanic, but years later they couldn't believe who he was. I still remember the sound of crystal shattering against the marble floor. That's how my mother responded when I told her I was marrying Jack Reynolds by hurling her champagne flute across the dining room. The family heirloom chandelier cast fractured light across the jagged pieces, much like how my life was about to splinter into before and after. "Have you lost your mind, Sophia?" My father's voice was calm, which was far more terrifying than if he'd shouted. Richard Carter never raised his voice. He didn't need to. As CEO of Carter Industries, he commanded rooms with a whisper. A mechanic? With nothing to his name? I stood my ground, the diamond on my left hand catching the light. It wasn't large. Jack had saved for 6 months to afford it, but to me, it outshone every jewel in my mother's extensive collection. His name is Jack Reynolds, and I love him. My mother, Vivian, dabbed at her eyes, careful not to smudge her perfectly applied makeup. Love? You think love will keep you in Christian Louboutins and summer homes in the Hamptons? Wake up, Sophia. You're a Carter. You have responsibilities. I'd known this moment would be difficult, but nothing prepared me for the cold calculation in their eyes. To them, I wasn't a daughter with hopes and dreams. I was an asset, a chess piece to be moved strategically across the board of high society. I don't care about the shoes or the Hamptons. I care about being happy. My father took a deep breath, straightening his monogrammed cuffs. Happiness is a luxury, Sophia. Security is a necessity. The Wilson son has shown interest in you. Harvard Business School, heir to Wilson Financial. That's the kind of man you should be with. I've met him once at a gala, and he spent the entire time talking about his yacht. At least he has a yacht. My mother threw her hands up. What does your mechanic have? Grease under his fingernails? A rented apartment? Dreams. He has integrity, kindness, and yes, dreams. Dreams we share. My father's patience was wearing thin. I could tell by the way he tapped his Mont Blanc pen against the mahogany table. 3 sharp clicks. Always 3. Sophia Elizabeth Carter, you will end this ridiculous engagement tonight, or what? I challenged, something I'd rarely done in my 25 years. Or you're no longer welcome in this family. The words hung in the air like poison gas, slowly suffocating the room. My younger sister Emma, who had been silently watching the drama unfold, gasped. "Daddy, you can't mean that," she whispered. "I absolutely do."
He turned to me.
Your trust fund, your position at the company, your place in this family, all of it gone if you choose this nobody. I'd expected resistance, perhaps even threats about my trust fund, but complete disownment? I hadn't prepared for that. My legs trembled beneath my designer dress, but I kept my chin up, another Carter family trait I couldn't seem to shake. Then I guess I'm no longer a Carter. I walked out that night with nothing but my personal belongings and the clothes I could fit into 2 suitcases. 25 years of privilege, connections, and financial security, gone in an instant. The mansion gates closed behind me with a definitive clang, and just like that, I was cut off. Jack picked me up in his weathered Ford pickup, concern etched across his face when he saw my tear-streaked cheeks. That bad, huh? I nodded, unable to form words around the lump in my throat. We'll figure out, sophomore. I promise. He squeezed my hand as we drove away from the only life I'd ever known, toward an uncertain future I'd chosen for love. The first months were the hardest. Jack's 1-bedroom apartment above Mrs. Finelli's Italian restaurant became our home. The constant smell of garlic and tomato sauce seeped through the floorboards, and the space was barely big enough for the 2 of us, let alone my remaining possessions. "I'm sorry it's not what you're used to," Jack said one night as we ate boxed macaroni and cheese, our 3rd time that week. "It's perfect," I lied, trying to ignore the sirens blaring outside our window and the mysterious water stains spreading across the ceiling. Jack worked 14-hour days at Reynolds Auto Repair, the small shop his uncle had started. I'd taken a job as a receptionist at a local salon after dozens of rejections from companies that wouldn't touch me without my father's influence. My new life was a crash course in reality. I learned that laundromats required exact change, that grocery shopping required a calculator, and that health insurance was astronomically expensive. The credit cards I'd once wielded without thought were now mathematical puzzles. Minimum payments, interest rates, and late fees became my new language. We married at the courthouse 3 months after I left home. No white dress, no string quartet, no champagne tower. Just us, 2 borrowed rings, and a justice of the peace who mispronounced Jack's middle name. My bouquet was made of daisies from the grocery store, wrapped in a ribbon I'd saved from a package. That night, as we celebrated with takeout Chinese food in our tiny apartment, Jack promised me the world. One day, I'll give you everything you deserve, Sophia Reynolds. I kissed him, tasting soy sauce and hope. I already have everything I need. But as weeks turned into months, reality continued to chip away at our optimism. Bills piled up faster than we could pay them. Our car broke down twice. Jack's uncle fell ill, putting more pressure on Jack to keep the shop afloat. I picked up extra shifts at the salon, started babysitting on weekends, and sold most of my designer clothes through consignment shops. The final blow came when my sister Emma's wedding invitation arrived. The envelope was thick, cream-colored cardstock with gold foil lettering, the kind of invitation my parents would have chosen for me in another life. Inside was a handwritten note from Emma. "I miss you. Please come." I traced my fingers over the elegant script, the date set for next month at the Plaza Hotel. The attached response card didn't have my name on it, just Mr. and Mrs. Jack Reynolds, as if my own identity had been subsumed. At the bottom, in my mother's handwriting, "No financial assistance will be provided for travel or accommodations." That night, I cried in the shower so Jack wouldn't hear me, watching as mascara I could barely afford anymore circled the drain. For the first time since walking out of my parents' house, I allowed myself to wonder if I'd made a terrible mistake. When I emerged, red-eyed but composed, Jack was sitting on our bed holding a small box. "What's this?" I asked, forcing a smile. "Open it." His eyes were tired, but his smile was genuine. Inside was a delicate silver locket. Nothing fancy, nothing expensive, but beautiful in its simplicity. "Happy 6-month anniversary," he whispered. "I know it's been hard, sophomore, harder than you ever imagined. But I promise you, everything will work out. We just need to hold on a little longer." I clutched the locket to my chest and nodded, wanting desperately to believe him. But as I looked around our cramped apartment, at the pile of bills on the counter, and the wedding invitation mocking me from the table, I couldn't help but hear my father's words echoing in my mind. Maybe happiness really was a luxury we couldn't afford. Winter settled over the city, like a cold, heavy blanket. Our apartment's ancient heating system wheezed and groaned, but barely kept the chill at bay. I'd taken to wearing 2 sweaters indoors, huddled under a pile of thrift store blankets while I scrolled through job listings on our shared laptop. "Anything promising?" Jack asked as he walked through the door, bringing with him the sharp scent of winter air and motor oil. "A few maybes." I didn't mention that I'd been rejected from 3 more office positions that morning. Companies seemed to sense the desperation in my voice during phone interviews. Jack kissed my forehead, his lips chapped from the cold. "Don't worry. February's always slow at the shop, but things will pick up." I nodded, not wanting to dampen his spirits by mentioning the past due electric bill hidden in my purse. We'd been playing financial Tetris for months, paying just enough on each bill to keep services running, juggling due dates, and living on ramen and peanut butter sandwiches. "How's your uncle doing?" I asked, changing the subject. Jack's face darkened. "Not great. The doctors are talking about another round of treatment." His uncle Frank, the only real family Jack had left, had been diagnosed with lung cancer 4 months ago. The medical bills were astronomical, even with Medicare. Jack had been sending what little we could spare, but it wasn't nearly enough. "I'm sorry." I squeezed his hand, feeling useless. In my old life, I could have written a check without a second thought. Now, I couldn't even afford to send flowers. Later that night, as Jack slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling, counting the cracks in the plaster. 8 months had passed since I'd walked out of my parents' home. 8 months of struggle, of pinching pennies, of watching Jack work himself to exhaustion. Love hadn't conquered all, It had just made the fall from grace more bearable. I thought of Emma's wedding, now just 2 weeks away. I hadn't sent back the RSVP card, torn between pride and longing. Part of me wanted to show up looking fabulous, to prove that I was thriving without my family's money. The realistic part knew I couldn't afford a dress nice enough to avoid pitying glances. My phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Please come. Dad doesn't have to know." I turned it face down without replying. Even if I wanted to go behind our father's back, Jack and I couldn't afford the trip to New York. The first sign that something wasn't right came a week later. Jack's phone rang during dinner, boxed pasta again, and he glanced at the screen with an odd expression before excusing himself to take the call in our tiny bathroom. Through the thin walls, I could hear his voice, low and urgent. "I told you not to call me at home." "No, it's too soon. I need more time." When he emerged, his face was carefully composed. "Everything okay?" asked, trying to sound casual. "Just work stuff." He smiled too brightly. "Tony needs help with a transmission tomorrow." I nodded, but something cold settled in my stomach. Jack had never lied to me before, at least I didn't think he had. Over the next few days, the strange calls continued. Jack would step outside our apartment or wait until I was in the shower. Twice, he disappeared for hours in the evening, claiming he was picking up extra work, but returning home without the cash that would normally come from a side job. My mind raced with possibilities, each more painful than the last. Was he having an affair? Had he fallen into gambling, trying to solve our money problems? Or worse, was he involved in something illegal? I checked his pockets one night while he showered, feeling like a suspicious housewife from a bad movie. Nothing but lint, his wallet with $11 inside, and a folded receipt. I smoothed it out, hands trembling. It was from a coffee shop across town, $40 for 2 lattes and pastries. Jack and I hadn't spent that much on coffee in months. My throat tightened. 2 lattes. "What are you doing?" I jumped, the receipt fluttering to the floor. Jack stood in the doorway, wearing only a towel, his hair dripping onto his shoulders. "Who were you at that Riverside cafe?" My voice sounded strange, even to myself. $40, Jack? We can barely afford groceries." Something flashed across his face. Not guilt, exactly, but wariness. "It's not what you think." "Then what is it?" "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're hiding something." He sat heavily on the bed, drops of water darkening the faded comforter. "I am hiding something, but not what you're thinking." "Then tell me." Frustration and fear made my voice crack. "We promised no secrets, remember?" Jack ran a hand through his wet hair. "Just trust me a little longer, sophomore. I'm trying to fix things." "Fix what?" "Us." Tears burned behind my eyes. "Because if that's what you're trying to fix, maybe you should start by being honest with me." "It's not about us. It's..." He trailed off, looking more conflicted than I'd ever seen him. "There are things about my family, about my past, that I never told you." A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with our faulty heating. "What things?" Before he could answer, his phone rang again. He glanced at it, then back at me, torn. "Take it," I said coldly. "It seems more important than this conversation." He hesitated, then answered. "Yes? Tomorrow?" "I don't know if I can." He glanced at me, then turned away. "Fine. 10 o'clock. When he hung up, the silence between us felt as vast as the financial gulf that separated my past from my present. "I have to go out tomorrow morning," he said finally. "To meet whoever's been calling you?" He nodded, looking tired beyond his 30 years. "Sophia, I promise. Everything will make sense soon. Just give me until tomorrow. Please." I wanted to fight, to demand answers, but exhaustion won out. "Fine. Tomorrow." That night, we slept facing away from each other. The space between us on our small bed somehow vast and unbridgeable. As I drifted into uneasy sleep, one thought circled in my mind. Whatever Jack was hiding, it would either save us or destroy us. And I wasn't sure which possibility frightened me more. I woke to an empty bed and the sound of rain against our window. Jack had already left for his mysterious meeting. The clock read 9:17 a.m. He'd let me sleep in, a small kindness that only irritated me more. I was tired of being handled, of being kept in the dark. The apartment felt even smaller in his absence, the walls closing in around me like a trap. I called the salon and told them I was sick, a luxury I couldn't afford, but today I couldn't face making small talk while my marriage potentially crumbled. By noon, Jack still hadn't returned or called. I paced our tiny apartment, alternating between worry and anger. What if he was in trouble? What if he never came back? What if? A sharp knock at the door interrupted my spiraling thoughts. 3 quick knocks. Decisive. Confident. Not Jack's knock, he had a key. Not Mrs. Finelli from downstairs, she always called up first. My heart rate doubled. Through the peephole, I saw a tall man in an impeccable charcoal suit, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the rain. He looked like he'd stepped out of one of my father's boardroom meetings. For a wild moment, I thought my father had sent someone to check on me, but I quickly dismissed the idea. Richard Carter didn't do welfare checks. He erased problems from his life with surgical precision. I cracked the door, keeping the chain on. "Can I help you? Mrs. Reynolds?" His voice was deep, cultured. He carried a sleek leather briefcase and held out a business card. "My name is Lawrence Whitman, of Whitman, Chun and Associates. I'm looking for your husband, Jack Reynolds." I examined the card through the gap. "An attorney?" My stomach dropped. Was Jack in legal trouble? "He's not here right now," I said cautiously. The man nodded as if this was expected. "May I come in? I have something rather important to discuss with both of you, but perhaps I could begin with you." Everything about him screamed money and power. The suit that probably cost more than our rent, the watch glinting at his wrist, the polished leather shoes. My instincts, honed over years of attending society functions with my parents, recognized his type. But what would an attorney like this want with us? Curiosity won out. I unlatched the chain and let him in. Mr. Whitman glanced around our apartment, taking in the water stain on the ceiling, the second-hand furniture, the pile of bills on the counter. His expression revealed nothing. "Would you like some coffee?" I offered, remembering my manners. "No, thank you." He sat on our sagging couch, placing his briefcase carefully on our scratched coffee table. "Mrs. Reynolds, how much has Jack told you about his family?" I blinked, caught off guard. "Not much. His parents died when he was young. He was raised by his Uncle Frank. That's about it." Mr. Whitman nodded slowly. "And has he ever mentioned his grandfather, Harold Reynolds?" "No, never." My pulse quickened. "Why?" He opened his briefcase and removed a thick folder. "Because Harold Reynolds passed away last week, and Jack is his sole heir." The words hung in the air, not making sense. "I don't understand. Jack never mentioned a grandfather." "They never met," Mr. Whitman said. "Harold had a falling out with Jack's father decades ago and cut all contact. But he kept tabs on Jack from a distance, his education, his career, everything." That's... I struggled to find words. Creepy? Intrusive? A hint of a smile crossed the lawyer's face. Perhaps. Or perhaps it was the only way Harold knew how to stay connected. He was a complicated man. So this grandfather Jack never knew died. And now he gets what? A keepsake? A letter? Mr. Whitman removed a document from his folder and slid it across the table. He gets everything. I glanced at the paper, catching phrases like estate valuation and preliminary assets. Then I saw the number at the bottom. This can't be right. My voice sounded distant, even to myself. "I assure you it is." Harold Reynolds was the founder and majority shareholder of Reynolds Technologies. He kept a very low profile, preferred to operate behind the scenes. Few people knew the extent of his wealth. I stared at the figure again. $147,362,000. Jack is rich. The words felt absurd coming out of my mouth. Extremely. There's the liquid assets, the company shares, the properties, including a penthouse in Manhattan, a villa in Tuscany, and the family estate in Connecticut. The full accounting will take some time, but yes, your husband is now one of the wealthiest men in the country. The room seemed to tilt. I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. Does Jack know?
He knows some of it.
We've been in contact for the past few weeks. Harold's health was failing, and we needed to prepare Jack for the transition. The phone calls, the disappearances, the coffee with 2 lattes. That's who he's been meeting in secret, I whispered.
You.
Or someone from your firm. Mr. Whitman nodded.
Yes.
Jack asked us to keep everything confidential until the details were finalized. He didn't want to give you false hope if there were complications. Why would there be complications? The lawyer hesitated. Some estranged family members have suddenly shown interest in reconnecting with Jack. Harold anticipated this and structured his will very carefully, but legal challenges are always possible when there's this much money involved. The bitter irony wasn't lost on me. While my family had disowned me for marrying a nobody, Jack's long-lost relatives were now circling like vultures, eager to claim kinship with him. Where is Jack now? I asked. At the family estate in Connecticut. He wanted to see it before making any decisions. He asked me to come get you. A car is waiting downstairs if you'd like to join him. The drive to Connecticut took just under 2 hours, but it felt like crossing into another dimension. Mr. Whitman's sleek town car glided past increasingly affluent neighborhoods until we turned onto a private road lined with ancient oak trees. My stomach knotted with each passing mile. How big is this estate? I asked, breaking the silence. 68 acres, Mr. Whitman replied. The main house is approximately 15,000 square feet. There's also a guest house, a caretaker's cottage, stables, though they're empty now, and a boathouse on the lake. I swallowed hard. And Jack owns all of this now.
Yes.
Along with the company headquarters in Boston, the manufacturing facilities in Michigan and Arizona, and various other properties. The car rounded a bend, and suddenly there was a sprawling stone mansion that looked like it belonged on a postcard from old money New England. Ivy climbed the walls, and perfectly manicured gardens stretched in every direction. It made my parents' home look modest by comparison. This can't be real, I whispered. The car stopped at the front entrance, where stone steps led to massive oak doors. Mr. Whitman handed me a business card with a phone number scrawled on the back. Jack is inside. I'll leave you 2 alone. Call this number when you're ready to discuss next steps. I stepped out of the car, my legs unsteady. Before I could ring the bell, one of the doors swung open. A woman in a crisp uniform nodded politely. Mrs. Reynolds, your husband is in the library. Please follow me. I trailed behind her through a soaring entryway with a chandelier that made the one in my parents' dining room look like a cheap knockoff. We passed room after room of antique furniture, original artwork, and gleaming hardwood floors. The house smelled of polish and old money, that indefinable scent of wealth accumulated over generations. The housekeeper stopped at a set of double doors and knocked softly before opening them. Mrs. Reynolds is here, sir. The library was straight out of a movie, 2 stories tall with walls of leather-bound books, rolling ladders, and a massive stone fireplace where a fire crackled despite the mild spring day. Jack stood by a window overlooking the gardens, his back to me. He'd changed clothes since this morning. Gone were the worn jeans and faded t-shirt, replaced by dress pants and a button-down shirt that fit him perfectly. When the doors closed behind me, he turned. His face was drawn, eyes troubled. Hey, he said softly. Hey yourself, I replied, not knowing what else to say. Nice place you've got here. A shadow of a smile crossed his face. Apparently, I crossed the room, stopping a few feet from him. Why didn't you tell me? He ran a hand through his hair, a familiar gesture that somehow looked out of place in these grand surroundings. I didn't know how, and I wasn't sure it was real at first. When Whitman contacted me, I thought it was some elaborate scam. But it's not.
No.
He gestured around the room. It's very real. All of it. Your grandfather, a man I never met, who basically spied on me my whole life, but never once reached out. Bitterness edged his voice. He had photos of me, Sophia, school pictures, newspaper clippings from when my high school baseball team made state finals. He had someone watching me all these years. I shivered. That's disturbing?
Yeah.
Jack turned back to the window. You know what's even more disturbing? Apparently, I look exactly like him. The housekeeper, she's worked here for 40 years. She started crying when she saw me. Said it was like seeing a ghost. I moved beside him, looking out at the immaculate gardens. Why did he leave everything to you? Guilt, maybe? According to Whitman, my father, his only son, wanted nothing to do with the family business. He wanted to be a teacher, marry my mother, live a normal life. My grandfather couldn't accept that. They fought, and my father left, cutting all ties. Then my parents died in that car accident when I was 7, and my grandfather, he just watched from a distance. Never offered to take me in. Let Uncle Frank raise me on a mechanic salary, struggled to put me through college. But he left you everything, I said softly. Blood is thicker than water, I guess. Even cold blood. Jack's jaw tightened. You know what Uncle Frank told me when I visited him last week? He said my grandfather sent him money every month for my care, substantial amounts, but made him promise never to tell me where it came from or that I had a wealthy grandfather. Uncle Frank put every cent in a college fund for me. He could have used that money for himself, for his medical bills now, but he didn't. Tears pricked my eyes. He loves you. Yeah. Jack's voice roughened. The only real family I had. And now. He gestured to the opulent room. Now I have all this, and cousins I've never met calling me, claiming we were always close. Distant relatives sending congratulations and business proposals. People coming out of the woodwork, all wanting a piece. I thought of my own family, who had cut me off without hesitation, and wondered if they knew about Jack's inheritance yet. It was only a matter of time before the news spread through social circles. What are you going to do? I asked. Jack turned to face me, his eyes searching mine. That depends. On us. What do you mean? Sophia, you married a mechanic with nothing to his name. Now He faltered. I'm the heir to a fortune I never knew existed, to a company I know nothing about running. Everything's different now. I felt a flicker of anger. Do you think I'm that shallow? That my feelings would change because of money? No, but I left everything for you, Jack. My family, my trust fund, my whole world. Not because I expected anything in return, but because I loved you. That hasn't changed. He reached for my hand. I know, but this, he gestured around us, this changes everything. We have options now. Choices. We could sell it all, give most of it away, keep just enough to be comfortable. Or we could step into this life, learn to run the company, become the people my grandfather wanted us to be. Or anything in between. A heavy silence stretched between us, filled with the weight of possibilities neither of us had ever imagined. What do you want? I finally asked. Jack's gaze drifted to a portrait above the fireplace, an austere man with Jack's eyes and jawline, dressed impeccably in a suit that screamed power and authority. I want to understand who he was, Jack said quietly. Why he did what he did. And then, he squeezed my hand. Then we decide what to do with his legacy. It took exactly 3 days for the news to reach my family. Jack and I had decided to stay at the estate while sorting through the mountain of legal and financial matters that came with an inheritance of this magnitude. We'd moved Uncle Frank to the best cancer treatment center in the country, arranged for Mrs. Finelli to sublet our apartment, and begun the dizzying process of learning about Reynolds Technologies, a company that apparently manufactured specialized components for everything from medical devices to aerospace systems. On the third morning, as I sat in the sunroom drinking coffee from a china cup that probably cost more than my old weekly salary, my phone lit up with a name I hadn't seen in 8 months, Mom calling. My hand trembled as I answered. Hello. Sophia, darling. My mother's voice was warm, effusive, a tone she usually reserved for her most important social connections.
How are you?
It's been far too long. I said nothing, letting the silence stretch uncomfortably. Sophia, are you there? A note of uncertainty crept into her voice. I'm here, I finally said, just surprised to hear from you. Well, your father and I have been thinking about you constantly. We miss you terribly. The lie was so blatant I almost laughed. Really? You've had a change of heart after 8 months of complete silence. She sighed dramatically. We may have overreacted about your situation. Parents make mistakes too, you know. My situation. I repeated the words flatly. You mean my marriage to Jack? Yes, well, we were concerned about your future. But it seems your young man has quite a promising career ahead of him after all. There it was. The real reason for her call. How did you find out? I asked, though I already had my suspicions. Margaret Wilson mentioned something at the club. Her husband's firm handles some legal work for Reynolds Technologies. Her voice brightened. Is it true you're staying at the family estate in Connecticut? I hear it's absolutely magnificent. It is, I said coldly. Though I'm surprised you care, considering you disowned me for marrying its owner. Darling, don't be dramatic. We never disowned you. We just needed some space to adjust to your decision. I gripped the phone tighter. You said, and I quote, "You're no longer welcome in this family." Dad made me return my house key. Heat of the moment, sweetheart. You know your father. He has a temper but always comes around. 8 months. 8 months of struggling to pay bills, of selling my belongings to make rent, of crying myself to sleep wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake. 8 months without a single call, text, or email from either of my parents. What do you want, Mom? She laughed, a tinkling sound I once found elegant, but now recognized as practiced, artificial. To reconnect, of course. Your father and I would love to visit. Perhaps this weekend? We could bring Emma and her fiancé. Make it a proper family reunion. The audacity was breathtaking. A family reunion, I repeated.
Yes.
And perhaps Jack could show your father his company operations. Richard has extensive experience in manufacturing that might be useful to Jack as he finds his footing. Of course. My father wanted a piece of the action, connections, opportunities, maybe even investments. Jack's inheritance wasn't just money, it was power and influence in circles my father had spent decades navigating. I'll have to check our schedule, I said, keeping my voice neutral. We're quite busy with the transition. Of course, darling, but do try to make time. Family is so important in times of adjustment. After hanging up, I sat motionless, watching a hummingbird dart among the garden flowers outside the window. A knot of emotion tightened in my chest, anger, hurt, and something else I couldn't quite name. Jack found me there an hour later, still staring out at the gardens. Everything okay? He asked, dropping a kiss on the top of my head. My mother called, his hand stilled on my shoulder. After all this time, what did she want? To reconnect. Apparently, they've suddenly remembered they have a daughter. I looked up at him. They want to visit this weekend. Jack's jaw tightened. Now that we're worth their time. Exactly. I laced my fingers with his. She didn't even apologize, Jack. Just pretended the last 8 months never happened. What did you tell her? That I'd check our schedule. I sighed. Part of me wants to tell them to go to hell, but another part wants closure, he finished for me. I get it. You need to look them in the eye, see who they really are. A sudden thought struck me. What if we invite them to Emma's wedding? Jack looked confused. I thought we weren't going. We weren't, when we couldn't afford it. But now, a plan was forming in my mind. Now we can not only attend, but we can be the generous aunt and uncle who give an extravagant wedding gift. We can face my parents on our terms, in public, where they'll have to acknowledge us. A slow smile spread across Jack's face. You're a little scary sometimes, you know that? I smiled back, feeling a strange power I'd never experienced before. I learned from the best. My father always said timing is everything in business. Speaking of timing, Jack said, suddenly looking uncomfortable, Lawrence called this morning. Some of my grandfather's associates want to meet me. Dinner tonight at the Plaza in New York. The Plaza? I raised an eyebrow. Fancy.
Yeah.
Apparently, they do this monthly executive dinner thing. They're expecting me to attend as the new majority shareholder. I squeezed his hand. We can cancel if you're not ready. He shook his head. I need to understand what I've inherited. All of it. The business, the expectations.
And
He hesitated. And Emma's wedding is at the plaza this Saturday. His eyes met mine. We could stay over, attend the dinner tonight, then be there for the wedding. The perfect setup. We'd arrive at the plaza not as desperate poor relations begging for scraps, but as wealthy, influential guests with a legitimate reason to be there. Do you think your parents will be at the rehearsal dinner tomorrow night? Jack asked. They're paying for it, so yes. His smile turned mischievous. Then let's make an entrance they won't forget. As I went upstairs to pack for our trip, my phone buzzed with a text from Emma. Mom says you're coming to the wedding?
please say yes.
I've missed you so much. Another message followed immediately. Dad's business is in trouble. He lost the Eastman contract and had to lay off staff. Mom's worried they might have to sell the house. They'd never admit it, but they're desperate. A cold satisfaction settled in my stomach. The tables had turned completely. My parents, who had rejected Jack for his lack of status and wealth, were now struggling financially while my reflection in the hallway mirror stopped me short. The woman staring back at me looked triumphant, calculating, exactly like my mother when she'd outmaneuvered a social rival. Was this who I wanted to become? Someone who measured relationships by their profit potential? I texted Emma back. Yes, we'll be there. And I've missed you too. Whatever game my parents were playing, I wouldn't lower myself to their level. Jack and I had been given an unexpected gift, not just wealth, but the chance to define what family truly meant. How we used that gift would reveal more about us than it ever could about them. The Plaza Hotel's grand ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers, champagne glasses, and the polished smiles of New York's elite. Emma looked radiant in her wedding gown, every inch the blushing bride my parents had always envisioned. When we arrived at the reception, conversation stilled, heads turned, and whispers rippled through the crowd. Ready for this? Jack squeezed my hand, looking impossibly handsome in his custom tuxedo. I nodded, scanning the room until I found them, my parents, positioned near the head table, greeting guests with practiced charm. They hadn't seen us yet. Let's get this over with, I murmured. We crossed the room, navigating through clusters of guests who suddenly seemed eager to make our acquaintance. I recognized the signs, the subtle assessments, the calculating smiles. These people had ignored me for 8 months, and now they couldn't wait to be introduced to the mysterious Reynoldses. My mother saw us first. Her eyes widened, her champagne glass pausing halfway to her lips. She nudged my father, who turned and froze, his practiced smile faltering. Sophia, my mother breathed as we approached. You came. We wouldn't miss Emma's big day. I kept my voice pleasant but cool. My father cleared his throat, extending his hand to Jack. Jack, good to see you. Congratulations on your inheritance. Quite a surprise for everyone. Jack shook his hand firmly. Thank you, Richard. Life is full of surprises, isn't it? The awkward silence that followed was interrupted by Emma, who rushed over and threw her arms around me. You're here. I was so afraid you wouldn't come. She pulled back, tears in her eyes. I've missed you so much, sophomore. For the first time that evening, my smile was genuine. I've missed you too, As Emma pulled Jack into a hug, my father leaned closer to me, lowering his voice. Your mother and I may have been hasty in our judgment. We should discuss the family business sometime. I think we could create some profitable synergies between Carter Industries and Reynolds Technologies. There it was, not an apology, but a business proposition. My mother nodded eagerly beside him, her eyes calculating yet hopeful. Perhaps we could have dinner next week, she suggested. At the house, we could catch up properly. I looked at my parents, really looked at them, and saw them clearly for perhaps the first time in my life. They weren't monsters or villains. They were simply people who had built their entire value system around wealth and status. They genuinely couldn't understand why I'd chosen love over money, because in their world, the two were inseparable. I'll think about it, I said finally. Later, during the reception, Jack and I slipped out onto the terrace for a moment of quiet. The New York skyline sparkled against the night sky, a constellation of human ambition. "Your father cornered me by the bar," Jack said, loosening his bow tie. "Offered me a strategic partnership. Apparently, Carter Industries is on the verge of a major breakthrough that just needs some capital investment." I shook my head. "He's drowning and he knows it. What do you want to do, Soph? We could save his company. It would be easy." I leaned against the stone balustrade, considering the question. 8 months ago, I would have given anything to have my family back. Now, I turned to face him. Now I realized they were never really mine to lose. They were always just investors waiting for returns. Jack's hand found mine. "So, what's the answer?" "I don't want revenge. That would make me just like them." I took a deep breath. "But I don't want to save them either. Not if it means enabling their values." "Then what?" The answer came to me with surprising clarity. "We'll offer to help Emma and her husband start their lives without debt. We'll make sure my parents don't lose their home. But we won't rescue the business, and we won't become their social ATM." Jack nodded slowly. "And Reynolds Technologies?" I smiled up at him. "I think your Uncle Frank could use a partner in that auto shop of his once he's well. Maybe expand it, create some jobs. And I've always wanted to start a foundation for first-generation college students." "What about the estate? The mansions?" "All of it. We'll keep what makes us happy and let go of what doesn't." I looked out at the glittering city. "Your grandfather's legacy doesn't have to define ours, Jack. We get to decide what wealth means to us." Jack pulled me close, resting his chin on my head. "The unseen legacy," he murmured. "Not the money or the mansions, but the choice to define family on our own terms." Inside, the reception continued, my parents networking, guests dancing, Emma radiant with joy. Out here, Jack and I stood at the crossroads of our new life, facing a future neither of us could have imagined. "Ready to go back in?" Jack asked after a while. I nodded, taking his hand. "Let's go." As we rejoined the celebration, I caught my father watching us with a mixture of calculation and genuine bewilderment. He would never understand the choice I'd made 8 months ago, just as he would never understand the choices Jack and I would make now. And that was okay. The greatest gift Jack's grandfather had given us wasn't the money or the status. It was the freedom to choose, to define success, family, and happiness on our own terms. To build a legacy not of wealth, but of integrity. To prove that sometimes, the richest inheritance isn't what's visible to the world, but what remains unseen: love, principle, and the courage to stand by both. In the end, we were neither the people my parents had raised me to be, nor the heir my grandfather had groomed Jack to become from afar. We were simply ourselves, Sophia and Jack Reynolds, navigating our way through an unexpected fortune without losing sight of what had made us fortunate all along: each other.